Every night in America, behind quiet doors and glowing windows, the same ritual unfolds. A lamp clicks on, envelopes scatter across a kitchen table, and someone sits in silence, staring at numbers that never seem to end. Bills, debts, promises once made in confidence, now heavy as stone. It's not one family. It's millions. The father in Ohio who once worked the mills. The mother in Texas trading sleep for double shifts. The young couple in California believing their first credit card was freedom. Different faces, different accents, yet bound by the same invisible chains. This is not the story of reckless choices. It's the story of trust, trust in systems, in promises, in a dream that told ordinary people they were safe if they only worked hard enough. But as history shows us, safety was always an illusion. In this film, we follow one family across generations, tracing how money built them, broke them, and silently shaped their destiny. Their story is not unique. That's why it matters. And as we step into their world, through breadlines and battlefields, suburbs and foreclosures, we'll confront the question every American fears: how do ordinary people fall into extraordinary financial traps? If you're feeling the weight of these stories already, stay with us. And while you're here, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. The year is 1932. The Great Depression has carved deep wounds across the United States, and in a small Ohio town, the Miller family is learning to live with less than they ever thought possible. Henry Miller had once worked in the steel mills. His hands were built for it, broad palms, thick knuckles, scarred from years of gripping tools hot from the furnace. Every clang of steel had once sounded like security, a rhythm that promised food on the table and pride in his chest. But now the mills had gone silent. Whole sections of town stood still, smokestacks cold, machinery rusting where it sat. Each morning, Henry left the house with the same worn hat on his head and walked to the edge of town. Breadlines stretched around the block, men shifting on their feet, staring at the ground as if eye contact might expose their shame. Henry stood among them, shoulders sagging, coat too thin for the bitter wind. When he came home, his silence was heavier than any hunger. Inside the house, Margaret tried to hold the pieces together. She patched old shirts until the fabric looked like a quilt of repairs. She boiled potatoes thin enough to stretch across 3 meals. At night, when the children were asleep, she whispered her worries into a notebook: lists of debts, items to barter, favors owed. She never let Henry see it. Their children, Thomas and Evelyn, didn't understand the numbers. They only knew the sound of their father's boots dragging on the porch, the way he avoided the kitchen table when bills appeared. Still, they found joy in the yard, Thomas chasing Evelyn, both laughing until their stomachs ached. For a few fleeting moments, the house felt alive again. 1933 brought darker days. Banks closed their doors without warning. Margaret had hidden 3 crumpled bills in an old sugar tin for emergencies, but the savings Henry had carefully deposited over years vanished overnight. It wasn't just money they lost, it was trust. The very institution they thought was safe had turned on them, leaving a wound that would never quite heal. Yet, small sparks of resilience remained. By 1934, new programs arrived under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Henry found work with the Civilian Conservation Corps, chopping wood, clearing land, repairing roads. It was hard labor for $1 a day, but that dollar carried the weight of survival. For the first time in years, Henry walked home with something in his pocket, and Margaret's eyes softened when she saw the bread he brought. The depression stretched on, but the family learned how to live in its shadow. They planted a garden behind the house, rows of potatoes, beans, and corn pushing through the soil. Margaret saved glass jars for canning. Evelyn learned to sew doll clothes out of scraps, while Thomas, now nearly a teenager, collected bits of metal to trade for pennies. Still, the fear never left. Even when Henry worked, even when the garden grew, there was always the knowledge that everything could disappear again. It hung in the air like smoke that never cleared. By 1939, whispers of war overseas began to reach their small town. The Millers heard it on the radio, grainy voices crackling through static. Germany. Poland. England. The children barely grasped what it meant, but Henry knew. Wars changed everything. Wars built factories, swallowed men, and left families to wait. Through 1940, the tension grew. Jobs returned to the mills as America supplied weapons abroad. Henry found shifts again, his hands returning to steel, though his body was weaker than it once was. Thomas, now 17, stood taller than his father, restless with the energy of youth. He wanted to help, to work, to prove he could carry the family forward. Evelyn, sweet-faced but determined, took on odd sewing jobs for neighbors. Every coin she earned she placed quietly on her mother's dresser. Then came 1941. Pearl Harbor. The news spread like fire. Thomas enlisted almost immediately, his mother clutching him at the station, tears wetting his collar. Henry's face was stone, pride and fear tangled so tightly they couldn't be separated. While Thomas trained, Evelyn found work in a nearby factory, her hair tied back, her hands blistering from long hours at the machines. Margaret rationed every scrap, sugar, flour, meat, stretching them the way she always had. Henry aged quickly, lines etching deeper across his face. The war brought wages, but it also brought silence at the dinner table, empty seats where Thomas once sat. The family survived, but something fundamental shifted. Security no longer felt real. Every paycheck, every meal, every moment together carried the weight of uncertainty. The Depression had taught them one lesson too deeply, that ordinary people could lose everything, even when they had done nothing wrong. And yet, as the war years unfolded, prosperity began to return. Factories roared again, money flowed into homes, advertisements filled the newspapers with promises of shiny new lives, refrigerators, radios, cars. Credit became less of a threat and more of an invitation. Buy now, pay later. The phrase echoed everywhere. For the Millers, it was tempting. After years of scraping by, the promise of comfort felt irresistible. But Henry, sitting on the porch at dusk, pipe smoke curling in the summer air, remembered 1933. He remembered the day the bank took everything. He watched his children step into a world of hope and abundance, and he feared how easily it could all be lost again. The story of financial traps does not begin with greed. For families like the Millers, it began with trust, and trust was already showing its cracks. The war ended in 1945, but the echoes of it lingered in every corner of America. In the Miller home, the day Thomas returned felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Margaret clutched him as though she could press the years of separation back into his skin. Evelyn stood taller now, her hands calloused from factory work, but her smile wide as ever when she saw her brother step through the door. Henry, older and slower, said little. He just reached out, gripped Thomas's hand, and nodded once. It was enough. Life after war was supposed to be different. Streets buzzed with parades, flags hung from every porch, and the newspapers spoke of prosperity just around the corner. For Thomas, opportunity arrived in the form of the GI Bill, a promise of education, affordable housing, and low-interest loans designed to reward those who had served. In 1946, he married a young woman named Helen, a schoolteacher from a nearby town. Together, they dreamed of building something new, something brighter than the hardships their parents had endured. With the GI Bill, Thomas and Helen were able to purchase a modest home in a freshly built suburb, rows of identical houses lined neatly like teeth. The mortgage stretched years into the future, but it was a debt they gladly accepted. For Margaret and Henry, visiting their son's home was like stepping into another world. The kitchen gleamed with modern appliances, a refrigerator that hummed, a stove with shining knobs, a radio perched proudly on the counter. Helen offered coffee in porcelain cups, something Margaret hadn't held since before the Depression. It was progress, undeniable progress. Yet, for Henry, the sight carried unease. He remembered too well how fragile stability could be. While Thomas spoke of installment plans and easy credit, Henry sat quietly in the corner, pipe smoke curling around him, wondering how many promises this new world could keep. The 1950s arrived with a wave of optimism. Across America, highways stretched farther, cars gleamed brighter, and televisions flickered in living rooms like windows to another life. Families gathered around black and white screens, watching shows that painted an image of America as endless abundance. The Millers weren't immune to the pull. Evelyn, now working as a secretary, saved for her own small car. She would drive through town with the windows rolled down, feeling for the first time that her independence had a shape, a sound, a speed. Thomas and Helen welcomed their first child, a boy named Robert, whose crib sat beneath a mobile of tin airplanes. Everywhere, advertisements shouted promises, buy now, pay later. Modern living within reach. Credit cards began to slip quietly into households, first as store cards, then as plastic rectangles that opened doors to instant satisfaction. Ordinary families, hungry for comfort after decades of war and depression, embraced them without hesitation. For Thomas, the logic was simple. He worked hard at a local manufacturing plant, his wages steady, his mortgage manageable. If a new washing machine made Helen's life easier, why wait? If a car brought freedom, why not sign the papers? Each monthly payment was small enough, and with overtime at the factory, he felt confident he could always keep up. But beneath the glossy surface of prosperity, subtle traps were forming. Interest rates, fine print, obligations stretched thin across years. Credit was no longer just a tool, it was becoming a habit. Families like the Millers didn't see chains being wrapped around them, they saw doors opening. Margaret noticed it first. On visits to Thomas and Helen's home, she would glance at the growing stack of envelopes on the hallway table, store statements, bank letters, bills tucked into neat piles. She said nothing, only smoothed the fabric of her dress with anxious hands. To her, debt was a shadow too familiar, one she feared would one day stretch over her son's young family. Henry shared her quiet worry. On warm evenings, he sat with Thomas on the porch, listening as his son spoke proudly of their new purchases. Henry nodded, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. He remembered the day the bank doors closed in 1933. He remembered how quickly hope could collapse. And he wondered if his son, in his eagerness to build, understood the ground beneath him was never as solid as it seemed. By the late 1950s, Robert was growing fast, his childhood filled with television jingles, shiny toys, and the steady hum of appliances his grandparents had never dreamed of. America was moving forward, and the Miller family was swept along with it. Yet beneath their laughter, beneath their suburban comforts, the first cracks were forming. The American dream was expanding, but so were its costs. And for the Millers, the traps of modern prosperity were only just beginning to tighten. The 1960s swept across America like a tide that no one could stop. Streets filled with music, protests, and voices demanding change. Television brought everything closer: civil rights marches, presidential speeches, soldiers in jungles half a world away. For families like the Millers, life felt both stable and uncertain at once. Inside Thomas and Helen's modest home, Robert was growing fast. At 6 years old, he loved the glow of Saturday morning cartoons, the taste of sugared cereal, the way the world outside seemed endless. His father, Thomas, rose before dawn each day, pulling on his work boots, heading to the factory where machines roared and sparks flew. Helen kept the home warm, her hands always busy, her smile patient but often tired. Margaret and Henry visited often. They were older now, slower in their steps, but the sight of their grandson brought life back to their eyes. Robert would climb into Henry's lap, tugging at the old man's pipe, asking him to tell one more story about the days before electricity filled every room. Henry would laugh softly, his voice gravelly, speaking of simpler times, though never forgetting the struggles that shaped them. Outside, America was changing. More families than ever moved into suburbs, and credit expanded like never before. In 1958, Bank of America introduced the first general-purpose credit card in California, and by the early 1960s, banks across the nation were mailing out cards to households who had never asked for them. For Thomas and Helen, the little piece of plastic felt like another step forward, a token of belonging to the modern middle class. Bills stacked neatly in drawers, but each month the numbers crept upward. A television console, a second car, new furniture for the living room, each purchase felt small on its own, but together they stretched Thomas's paycheck thinner than he realized. The factory still paid well, and overtime helped, but costs had a way of multiplying. Helen began to notice it late at night, when the house was quiet. She'd sit at the kitchen table, letters spread before her, a pencil resting against her cheek. The numbers never looked quite as comfortable as Thomas's optimism suggested. Still, she folded the papers away, tucked them back in the drawer, and smiled when Robert bounded in the next morning asking for pancakes. By 1963, the Millers' suburb looked almost identical to every other: trimmed lawns, new cars in driveways, children riding bicycles along sidewalks. There was safety in sameness, comfort in the hum of collective prosperity. Yet behind those painted doors, more families than ever carried balances that grew heavier each month. Robert, too young to understand, absorbed everything. He saw the excitement in his parents' eyes when new appliances arrived, the tension in Helen's furrowed brow when she thought no one was watching. He grew up with commercials jingling in his head, teaching him that happiness came wrapped in packaging, delivered by department stores, financed with easy payments. For Thomas, there was pride in giving his son what he had never known as a child: comfort, security, the feeling that the world was open. He remembered nights during the Depression when the cupboards were bare, when his mother stitched old clothes into new shapes. He swore Robert would never know that kind of hunger. And if it meant signing another credit agreement, then so be it. The early 1960s also carried shadows. Newsreels spoke of conflict in a faraway place called Vietnam. Protests began to ripple across college campuses. For now, these were only background noises in the Miller household. Thomas believed in steady work, steady pay, and keeping his head down. But Robert, growing older, would eventually come of age in a country that no longer felt so steady. By the middle of the decade, Margaret's health began to decline. She spent more days resting, her hands weaker, her energy dimming. Henry stayed close by her side, cooking simple meals, carrying the weight of their years together with quiet dignity. When they visited Thomas's family, Robert would kiss his grandmother's cheek, her skin thin and cool, her smile faint but full of love. Life in the Miller family seemed ordinary, almost typical of its time. But woven into the ordinary were patterns repeating themselves: the belief that debt was manageable, that tomorrow's paycheck would always be enough, that prosperity once gained could never be lost. Robert was too young to see it, but the traps were already tightening around his family. They were not dramatic collapses, not sudden disasters, but slow, quiet commitments that grew heavier with every passing year. In the living room, the television flickered with images of astronauts reaching for the stars, of speeches that stirred the nation, of tragedies that silenced it. Robert watched wide-eyed, never realizing that the greatest story unfolding wasn't on the screen, but inside his own home, where the promise of the American dream was slowly being traded for something much harder to escape. The 1970s arrived not with fireworks, but with a heaviness that seemed to settle in the air. Gasoline lines stretched for blocks. Prices climbed higher each month. And for families like the Millers, the once steady ground beneath them began to feel uncertain. Robert was a teenager now, tall, restless, his world expanding beyond the neat rows of his suburban street. He carried within him both the pride of his father's sacrifices and the quiet unease of his mother's worry. The television, once a source of wonder, now showed images that stirred arguments at the dinner table. Protests filled the streets, draft numbers scrolled across the screen, and the war in Vietnam no longer felt like distant noise, it was a looming possibility. Thomas tried to shield his son from it. He spoke of responsibility, of work, of keeping your head down. But Robert's friends whispered different stories, of boys a year older already gone overseas, of letters home that stopped too soon. At night, Robert lay awake listening to the faint hum of his parents' voices through the wall. Helen prayed quietly, asking for her son's safety, even as she tried not to let the fear show. Meanwhile, money no longer stretched the way it once had. Inflation ate away at paychecks. The same groceries that filled the pantry last year now left gaps on the shelves. The factory still ran, but overtime wasn't guaranteed, and layoffs whispered through the break rooms. Credit, once a symbol of progress, had become a lifeline. The balance on the card no longer disappeared each month, it lingered, carrying interest that grew heavier with time. Helen, always cautious, saw the numbers inch upward. She clipped coupons, stretched meals, wore the same dress to church more Sundays than she wished. Thomas brushed it off, insisting it would even out when hours picked back up. But behind his steady tone, he too felt the tightening. Robert, at 17, began to notice. He saw the way his mother pressed her lips thin when the mail came, the way his father sat a little longer at the table before standing. But in his own world, other distractions pulled, records spinning rock and soul, posters of athletes taped to bedroom walls, the thrill of his first used car, bought on a loan that already tied him to the system before he truly understood it. 1973 brought the oil crisis, and with it, long lines of cars idling, frustration boiling. Robert sat in the passenger seat as Thomas cursed under his breath, counting the minutes, the dollars wasted. It wasn't just fuel, it was a reminder of how fragile everything was. A single shock rippled into every corner of life, raising prices, thinning patience. At school, teachers spoke of changing times. Some spoke with hope, others with worry. The American dream, once a straight road of work and reward, was beginning to show cracks. The Millers weren't destitute, not yet. But the comfort that had seemed permanent in the 1960s now felt conditional, breakable, and Robert absorbed it all. Margaret passed away in 1974. Her final years had been gentle, spent mostly in her chair by the window, a blanket over her knees, her eyes following the shifting light. When she was gone, the house felt emptier than words could hold. Henry, though steady in his grief, carried a silence that worried Thomas. For Robert, it was his first true confrontation with loss. Standing by the grave, he felt the weight of generations, the sacrifices that came before, the fragility of everything promised. As the decade moved forward, Robert graduated high school. He wasn't drafted, the lottery spared him, but many of his friends were not so lucky. Some came back changed. Some never came back at all. Robert carried their absence with him, a reminder that survival itself was sometimes nothing more than chance. He found work at a local auto shop, the scent of oil and metal clinging to his hands. The pay wasn't much, but it was something. At night, he dreamed of more, college, travel, a chance to step beyond the town that shaped him. Yet money always circled back into the conversation. Tuition felt impossible, and every paycheck disappeared faster than it arrived. Helen urged him to save. Thomas encouraged him to just get steady work and stay loyal. But Robert, watching the world shift, wasn't sure loyalty alone could protect him anymore. By the late 1970s, America felt restless. The glow of post-war prosperity had dimmed. Factories struggled, unions fought to hold on, and wages lagged behind the cost of living. The Millers carried on, quietly, with dignity, but also with growing cracks beneath the surface. And in those cracks, Robert's future was already forming, a life shaped by debts inherited not through paperwork, but through habits, assumptions, and the slow normalization of financial struggle. The traps were no longer hidden. They were sitting in plain sight, written into monthly statements, disguised as ordinary life. The 1980s arrived with neon lights, bold promises, and the hum of an America desperate to feel strong again. Ronald Reagan's voice filled living rooms, assuring citizens that morning had returned, that the country was back on track. For Robert Miller, now in his 20s, the decade felt like a doorway into adulthood, glowing with both possibility and risk. He had married young, Linda, a schoolteacher's daughter with kind eyes and a steady laugh, became his partner in 1981. Their wedding was modest, a church hall decorated with paper flowers, a borrowed suit, and a cake baked by Helen. Yet to Robert, it felt like the beginning of everything. The newlyweds rented a small apartment on the edge of town. Robert left the auto shop for steadier factory work, the kind of job his father had always praised, honest, hands-on, reliable. Linda taught at the local elementary school, her patience tested daily by classrooms full of restless children. Together, their combined income gave them just enough to dream of something bigger, a house, a car, perhaps one day a family of their own. And then came the offers. Credit cards, once rare, now arrived in glossy envelopes addressed directly to Robert and Linda. Some days, multiple cards would appear, promising low rates, generous limits, and rewards programs designed to entice. For a couple eager to furnish their first home, it felt like an invitation they couldn't refuse. A new couch, a television larger than the one Robert had grown up with, a microwave that seemed like magic, all charged, all manageable, or so it seemed. Each purchase carried a thrill, a sense of belonging to the modern, fast-paced America shown on television ads. Linda worried sometimes, sitting at the table in the evenings with the bills spread out before her. "It adds up, Robert," she'd say softly, her pencil circling the totals. He would shrug, kiss her on the forehead, and remind her of what his father always believed, that steady work would always catch up, that as long as he punched the clock, they'd be fine. Meanwhile, the world around them shifted. Wall Street surged, computers began to hum in offices, and a culture of consumption took hold. Greed is good, the movies declared, and for many Americans, it felt true. The economy boomed on paper, wages trickled slower, and families leaned more and more on credit to fill the gaps. Robert's factory job kept him busy, but whispers of layoffs occasionally drifted through the halls. Automation was creeping in. Management spoke of efficiency, of tightening belts, of foreign competition. Robert ignored the unease, focusing instead on the life he and Linda were building. In 1983, they welcomed their first child, a daughter, Emily. She arrived on a cold January night, her cries filling the hospital room, her tiny fist wrapped tightly around Robert's finger. The moment felt sacred, binding. He promised silently that she would never know the struggles he once saw in his parents' eyes. The promise was heavy, but Robert carried it willingly. He picked up overtime whenever possible, and Linda balanced motherhood with part-time teaching. Their little apartment grew crowded, so they signed papers on their first mortgage, a modest house with a patch of grass out front and a swing set Robert built with his own hands. But behind the joy lurked numbers. Credit balances crept higher. Mortgage payments stretched them thin. Medical bills from Emily's birth lingered longer than expected. Linda managed the accounts carefully, but the math never seemed to bend as easily as Robert's optimism. By the mid-1980s, the nation faced the savings and loan crisis, a wave of risky lending and collapsing institutions. Robert heard about it on the evening news but paid little attention. To him, it was politics, far removed from his life of timecards and pay stubs. But quietly, the crisis tightened credit markets, raised interest rates, and left families like his more vulnerable than they realized. Thomas and Helen, older now, watched their son step into the same cycle they once knew: pride in providing, reliance on credit, hope that hard work would outpace debt. Thomas offered advice sparingly, sensing that Robert wanted to prove himself. Helen, more tender, reminded her son that money carried weight, that sometimes too much could crush even the strongest. Robert listened politely, then returned to his own calculations. He wanted more for Emily. He wanted her to feel secure, to never doubt that she belonged in the bright, confident America unfolding on magazine covers. By 1987, when the stock market crashed on a day forever called Black Monday, Robert was at work, unaware of the panic rippling through banks and brokers. His factory paycheck came as usual, his daughter was learning her first words, his wife was preparing dinner. But the ripples of that crash would echo far beyond Wall Street, reaching into the lives of families like his in ways he couldn't yet see. In the Miller household, the 1980s were years of hope and quiet traps. The furniture looked new, the house felt full, the family was growing. Yet beneath it all, the balances ticked upward, one monthly statement at a time. The dream was alive, but it was paid for with borrowed time. The 1990s opened with a strange mix of optimism and unease. The Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall crumbled, and America declared itself the sole superpower of the world. On television, presidents promised a new century of prosperity, technology, and limitless possibility. Yet in homes like the Millers, the promises sounded louder than the paychecks that struggled to keep up. Robert was in his mid-30s now, his hair a little thinner, his shoulders broader from years of factory labor. The plant had changed. Machines grew smarter, faster, while workers like him were told to adapt or risk being replaced. Efficiency, management called it. But Robert knew what it really meant: fewer men on the floor, more pressure on those who remained. Linda, still teaching part-time, had learned to stretch every dollar. Coupons lined the kitchen drawer, careful lists filled her notepad, and each month she shifted numbers around like puzzle pieces. The mortgage, the car loan, the credit card bills, medical costs, somehow she made it fit. Somehow she always did. Emily was 10 when the decade began, bright-eyed, curious, already asking questions that made her parents smile nervously. She loved books, devoured them under the covers by flashlight. She asked about the wider world, about college, about what she could one day become. Robert and Linda encouraged her, telling her she could do anything, be anything. But each time, the thought of tuition hung in the back of their minds like a cloud they tried to ignore. By the mid-1990s, America was in the midst of a technological revolution. Computers entered classrooms, dial-up internet sang its static song in suburban bedrooms, and families like the Millers felt the pull to keep up. Robert brought home a bulky desktop computer, purchased on credit, insisting Emily needed it for school. Linda said nothing, though she worried about the balance that was already straining their monthly budget. The factory had weathered changes, but the whispers of outsourcing grew louder. Friends of Robert lost jobs, entire departments moved overseas where labor cost less. Each round of layoffs shook him, though he managed to survive. He worked longer hours, accepted smaller raises, and told himself he was lucky to still be employed. But luck did not ease the bills that stacked steadily higher. Emily, entering her teenage years, saw the strain without being told. She noticed her mother's silence when the mail arrived, her father's weariness when he came home late. Yet she also saw the sacrifices: they never missed a birthday cake, never let her go to school without proper clothes, never failed to encourage her dreams. She excelled in class, her teachers urging her toward college. They spoke of scholarships, loans, opportunities. Emily listened, hope burning in her chest, not yet understanding the weight those loans carried. For Robert and Linda, the talk of college filled them with pride, but also dread. They knew the numbers. They knew what it would take. Credit in the 1990s became easier than ever. Pre-approved offers flooded their mailbox. Linda tried to resist, but emergencies had their own way of deciding: car repairs, medical bills, Emily's school trips, the unexpected leaks and breaks that came with owning a home. Each swipe of plastic was small, justified, necessary. But over years, the balances grew into something harder to escape. Helen, now elderly, often sat quietly in the living room when they visited. Her eyes clouded with age, her hands frail, but her memory sharp. She would sometimes take Linda's hand and whisper, "Be careful with money, dear. It can disappear faster than you think." Linda nodded, hearing the truth, though there was little choice left but to carry on. By the late 1990s, Robert was nearing 40. His body ached more, his energy thinner. The factory gave him steady pay, but never security. Emily, now a teenager, began filling out college applications, her eyes glowing with ambition. Robert swelled with pride but felt the old knot of fear tighten in his chest. He remembered his own father's promises, his own mother's warnings. One evening, as Emily read brochures at the kitchen table, Robert sat across from her, watching her trace the pictures of campuses, dorms, libraries. He wanted to say yes to everything she dreamed of. He wanted to promise it would all work out. Instead, he reached for Linda's hand under the table. They both smiled at their daughter, while quietly exchanging the same unspoken worry. The American dream was still alive in their home, but it carried a new cost. Not just the long hours, not just the strain, it carried numbers that would soon follow their daughter into adulthood, numbers that looked harmless on paper but felt like chains when the bills came due. And so, as the decade closed, the Millers stood at the edge of a new century. The world around them shimmered with technology, progress, and promises. Yet inside their home, the same question echoed quietly, generation after generation: how long can ordinary families keep borrowing against a future that never truly arrives? The new century arrived with the hum of anticipation. The world counted down to midnight in 1999, fireworks lit the sky, and for a fleeting moment, America seemed invincible. Robert held Linda's hand that night as Emily, now 17, laughed with friends in the living room. He watched her smile, so full of promise, and thought, this is what it was all for. But the promise of the new millennium carried a price. Emily received her acceptance letters in the spring of 2000. A college 2 states away, small but respected, offered her a place. Scholarships helped, but not nearly enough. Robert and Linda sat at the kitchen table, papers spread across the surface, listening as financial aid officers explained loans, repayment schedules, interest rates. The numbers were dizzying. Linda chewed her lip, Robert signed where he was told. Emily hugged them both, too young to see the weight that had just settled over the family. They borrowed for tuition. They borrowed for housing. They borrowed because the dream demanded it. At the same time, the economy shook. The dot-com bubble burst, erasing fortunes overnight. Robert, still at the factory, watched coworkers lose their retirement savings in markets they barely understood. "It doesn't affect us," he told Linda, though he felt the tremor in his bones. The dream of easy wealth through stocks vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. And then, September 11, 2001. The world stopped. Robert was at work when someone turned on the radio. Planes. Towers. Smoke. He rushed home, finding Linda in front of the television, her hand over her mouth. Emily called from campus, her voice shaking. For days, the family watched the footage replay, over and over, as fear rippled across the country. The years after September 11 felt heavier. Wars began, costs rose, and fear became a currency of its own. Robert worked overtime when he could, though his back ached, his knees stiffened. Linda picked up extra tutoring. Emily studied late into the night, her loan balances already climbing. By 2005, she graduated. The diploma felt like triumph, yet the weight of debt clung immediately. Letters arrived with repayment schedules, monthly minimums, interest that seemed to multiply on its own. Robert wanted to help, but his own balances had grown, credit cards near their limit, a second mortgage taken to cover repairs, health bills from a surgery he had delayed too long. Emily found work, but not in her field. She waited tables, took internships that promised experience but little pay. She moved back home for a time, her boxes stacked in her childhood room, the walls still covered with posters from her teenage years. She smiled for her parents, insisting she was fine, but late at night Linda sometimes heard her daughter crying softly through the wall. Meanwhile, the Millers' neighborhood was changing. New houses rose nearby, financed by loans that seemed too generous, too easy. Friends and co-workers bragged about refinancing, about flipping properties, about mortgages that promised low payments now, higher later. Robert listened, nodded politely, but wondered how safe any of it really was. Thomas had passed away quietly in 2004, his heart finally giving out. At the funeral, Robert stood by the grave with Emily and Linda, remembering his father's words about steady work and responsibility. He wondered if those lessons still held in a world that seemed to shift faster every year. By the mid-2000s, the signs were all there, interest rates rising, debt swelling, warnings whispered in business sections of newspapers. But for families like the Millers, the warnings were drowned out by the rhythm of daily life. Bills had to be paid, dinners had to be cooked, children had to be encouraged to keep dreaming. Emily, still young, still hopeful, believed she could outrun the numbers. Robert and Linda, older now, quietly feared that the numbers were already outrunning them. The traps had grown larger, more sophisticated, dressed in contracts and glossy brochures. Yet they carried the same core truth Henry once knew, Margaret once warned, Helen once whispered: promises made on borrowed money could collapse with the slightest shift in the wind. And as the decade moved toward its end, that collapse was already on its way. By 2007, the air felt different. Billboards promised no money down mortgages. Friends bragged about buying second homes, flipping them for profit, trading square footage like it was poker chips. Emily listened to her co-workers talk about condos and new cars, even though she was still buried in student debt. Robert, standing at the break room vending machine, heard men half his age describe how they'd refinanced their homes and pulled out cash as if it were free. The Millers didn't refinance. They couldn't. Their credit cards were stretched thin, their second mortgage already heavy. Instead, they tried to hold steady while the world seemed drunk on borrowed money. Then, the bubble burst. 2008. Headlines screamed of bank failures, collapsing markets, foreclosures that swept through neighborhoods like a storm. Robert came home one evening, his lunchbox still in his hand, to find Linda sitting at the kitchen table, the mail spread in front of her. She had that look, the one she wore when she was trying not to cry. Bills. Overdue notices. Interest rates jumping. Emily, now in her late 20s, was working 2 jobs. One in an office that promised opportunity, but delivered little more than minimum salary, another at night, bartending, just to keep her loan payments alive. She watched her friends scatter, some moving back with parents, some defaulting quietly, some vanishing into cities looking for fresh starts. On the news, they showed rows of families packing their lives into cardboard boxes, their homes claimed by banks. Whole blocks turned dark, windows boarded, grass uncut. In their own town, for sale signs multiplied like weeds. Robert's factory cut hours. Then shifts. Then workers. One morning, his name was on the list. After 30 years of steady labor, he stood at the gate with a cardboard box of his belongings, the world around him suddenly silent. He drove home in the daylight, not knowing how to tell Linda. She already knew. She'd seen the news. She'd felt the ground shifting beneath them for months. When Robert walked through the door, she didn't ask questions. She just held him, as though holding on might stop the fall. Emily returned home that night, exhausted, her shirt smelling faintly of spilled beer. She found her father sitting in the dark, staring at the floor. For the first time in her life, she saw him not as unshakable, not as the steady provider, but as a man caught in the same trap she feared for herself. The family cut back. Dinners shrank. Vacations vanished. The heat was lowered in winter, lights turned off earlier. They learned to live on less, though even less felt impossible. Linda took extra students to tutor. Robert picked up odd jobs, fixing cars in a neighbor's garage, helping with construction when he could. Emily scraped by, handing small portions of her paycheck to her parents even when her loans demanded more. And yet, the debt didn't shrink. It grew. Interest piled on interest. Minimum payments barely covered the cost of staying afloat. The harder they worked, the deeper the hole seemed to stretch. In 2009, foreclosure notices touched even closer. A family they'd known for years packed their belongings into a rental truck, leaving the house across the street dark and empty. The sound of their laughter, once carried across summer evenings, was replaced by silence. The Millers clung to their own house like it was a lifeboat. Every month, they scraped together just enough to keep the mortgage alive, terrified of what would happen if they slipped even once. For Emily, the lesson was searing: a degree didn't guarantee safety, a job didn't guarantee progress, and even decades of loyalty to a company could end with a name on a layoff list. For Robert and Linda, the weight was heavier still. They had lived through crises before, the oil shocks, the recessions, the layoffs. But this was different. This time, the storm seemed designed to crush ordinary families while sparing the institutions that had fed off their dreams. By the end of the decade, the Millers were still standing, but barely. The laughter around their dinner table was softer, more fragile. Hope was still there, but it was a thin hope, cautious, careful, almost afraid to breathe too deeply. And deep down, they knew, the trap had closed tighter. The only question now was how long they could survive inside it. The years after the crash were quieter, but no easier. By 2011, the headlines had shifted from panic to recovery. Politicians spoke of green shoots, Wall Street celebrated bonuses, and markets rebounded. But for families like the Millers, recovery was a word that lived only on television. Robert, now in his late 50s, worked wherever he could. Small construction crews paid in cash. Weekend repairs on neighbors' roofs. A few hours at a local hardware store, where his back ached under fluorescent lights. His hands, once strong and steady, had grown stiff, the years of factory labor catching up to him. Every ache reminded him that retirement was no longer a dream, just a fading mirage he couldn't afford. Linda tutored more than ever. Evenings filled with algebra and essays, the dining room table stacked with papers from children not her own. She smiled, patient as always, but inside she carried a growing fear: what would happen when she and Robert grew too old to keep working? There was no pension waiting, only the modest trickle of Social Security, already stretched thin. Emily, now in her 30s, felt trapped between two worlds. Her student debt still shadowed her, interest making a mockery of every payment. Yet she also felt the pull of responsibility, helping her parents, buying groceries, covering bills when unexpected costs appeared. She lived in a small apartment nearby, but she spent more nights at her parents' kitchen table than in her own living room. The gig economy was rising. Friends took jobs delivering packages, driving strangers across town, picking up shifts through apps that promised flexibility. Emily tried it too, delivering food in the evenings after her office job. But flexibility came at a cost: no benefits, no security, no guarantee of tomorrow's pay. Every mile wore down her old car, every tip reminded her how fragile her life had become. Healthcare became another quiet enemy. Robert's back pain grew worse, but doctor visits meant copays they couldn't spare. When Linda's blood pressure spiked, she waited weeks before scheduling an appointment, hoping it would pass. Emily skipped dental checkups, convincing herself the discomfort was nothing serious. Insurance existed on paper, but the deductibles were mountains they couldn't climb. Through it all, the American dream was still marketed like a product. Ads showed smiling families in new kitchens, shiny cars gliding down open highways. Credit card offers filled the mailbox, each envelope whispering the same promise: easy money, just one signature away. The Millers had learned to distrust those whispers, but resisting them only made survival harder. In their town, the landscape shifted. Small businesses closed, replaced by dollar stores and payday lenders. Empty lots where factories once stood grew weeds tall enough to swallow rusting fences. People moved away, chasing opportunity that rarely lasted. Those who stayed seemed older, quieter, their faces lined with the same exhaustion Robert saw in his own mirror. Emily dated briefly, but every relationship stumbled against the same barrier: money. Conversations about marriage or children collapsed under the weight of debt and uncertainty. She envied friends who seemed freer, even as she suspected they were just hiding their struggles better. One night, sitting alone in her apartment, Emily opened her laptop and scrolled through her loan statements. The balance was nearly the same as it had been a decade earlier, despite years of payments. Her chest tightened. She thought of her parents, aging and still working, still carrying their mortgage, still pretending it was all manageable. And she wondered if she was destined for the same cycle, her life measured in interest rates and due dates. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda tried to protect her from their own fear. They spoke hopefully, celebrated small victories: a bill paid, a loan nearly finished, a rare dinner out. But when they lay in bed at night, the silence carried the truth neither wanted to say aloud: the trap had changed shape, but it hadn't loosened. By the mid-2010s, the Millers had become experts at surviving, but survival is not the same as living. And beneath their quiet routines, the question that haunted them most was the same one haunting millions of Americans: how much longer could they keep going before the system broke them completely? By 2017, the air was different again. Markets boomed, politicians promised prosperity, and headlines spoke of record highs. But for the Millers, the so-called recovery never quite reached their front door. Emily, now edging into her 40s, carried herself with the calm of someone who had learned to endure disappointment. She worked a steady office job, one she had earned through persistence rather than luck, yet every paycheck seemed to dissolve before it touched her hands. Rent, loans, bills, survival disguised as progress. She smiled when coworkers talked of vacations or weekend shopping, but behind that smile was calculation: how many dollars could she spare, how many more hours of side work would it take just to stay level? Her parents were slowing. Robert's back pain had grown sharper, spreading into his legs. Some days he could barely stand upright. Linda urged him to see a specialist, but the cost hung over them like a threat. They managed the pain with over-the-counter pills, heating pads, and silence. Linda herself was tired. Years of tutoring had worn her down. She still graded papers at the dining table, glasses perched low on her nose, but sometimes her hand trembled as she wrote. Her doctor had warned her: blood pressure, cholesterol, the silent markers of stress. She nodded politely at each appointment, then returned to the cycle that kept them afloat. The house, their fragile anchor, was still theirs. But repairs piled up: a leaking roof, a furnace that rattled in winter, plumbing that groaned in the walls. Each problem was a reminder that time was moving faster than their money. Emily tried to help. She handed over cash when she could, brought groceries when she visited, paid for small repairs quietly so her parents wouldn't argue. But her own debt still shadowed her. Even after decades of payments, the balance remained stubborn, swollen by interest that mocked her persistence. Some nights she sat awake, staring at her laptop screen, her chest tight with the realization that she might never truly be free. Around them, the world painted a different picture. Social media overflowed with curated lives, smiling faces in expensive restaurants, weddings draped in flowers, new homes gleaming under perfect light. Emily scrolled through the images, caught between envy and disbelief. She knew many of those people were carrying their own hidden burdens, but the illusion still stung. In their town, payday lenders glowed at night like neon traps. Pawn shops multiplied. Older neighbors lost homes, replaced by younger renters who came and went quickly. A sense of impermanence hung in the air, as if stability itself had become a luxury. Robert and Linda began to talk quietly about retirement, though both knew it was a dream too costly to claim. Social security might keep them alive, but it would never let them rest. They pretended otherwise, discussing travel or hobbies, but each time the conversation ended with silence. They couldn't afford to stop working, not yet. By 2019, Emily's face showed new lines, the kind carved by worry more than age. She carried herself with resilience, but she felt the weight of being the bridge between generations, supporting her parents while trying to hold her own fragile ground. Her friends had begun to speak of midlife choices, homes, children, investments, but for Emily, those words belonged to another world. And then came whispers. News anchors mentioned instability. Economists debated bubbles, downturns, risks of collapse. For families like the Millers, those weren't abstract terms. They were warnings, reminders of 2008, memories of pink slips and foreclosure signs. At night, as Emily drove home from work, she noticed how quiet the streets had become. Shops shuttered early. Restaurants thinned out. People seemed more cautious, more alert, as though sensing the tremor before the quake. In the Miller home, Robert sat at the table, hands folded, staring at nothing. Linda hovered nearby, rubbing her temples. Emily walked in, setting her purse down, and the silence between them said more than words. They had survived so much, endured for decades, but something darker loomed on the horizon. They didn't know its shape yet. They only knew this: when the next storm came, they might not have the strength left to withstand it. The world didn't collapse with an explosion. It collapsed with silence. March 2020. Streets emptied. Offices went dark. Schools closed their doors. The hum of daily life, the traffic, the laughter spilling from restaurants, the thrum of factories, vanished almost overnight. Emily sat in her apartment, staring at her phone, reading the same headline again and again: shutdown. She had packed her laptop and files from the office the week before, expecting a short break, maybe a few weeks of remote work. But the weeks became months. Her company sent emails filled with words like uncertainty, temporary, adjustments. She knew what those words meant. They were code for cuts. Robert and Linda were suddenly at the highest risk. Their age, their health, everything the news warned about seemed to describe them directly. Emily drove over with groceries, wearing a mask, leaving bags on the porch, waving through the glass. She wanted to hug her parents, but instead she stood 6 feet away, heart aching at the distance. Money tightened further. Robert's odd jobs evaporated, no one wanted strangers in their homes. Linda's tutoring dried up too. Parents canceled sessions, schools scrambled online. The modest stream of income that had kept them alive slowed to a trickle. Emily's hours were cut. She picked up gig work again, delivering food to houses where she wasn't allowed inside. She drove past neighborhoods of silent streets, leaving bags on porches, photographing them for proof, and moving on. Every trip carried a quiet fear, one cough, one mistake, one encounter too close, and she could bring home more than groceries. Inside the Miller house, time felt heavy. Robert's back worsened. He groaned when he stood, sometimes unable to rise without help. Linda developed a persistent cough, each sound slicing through Emily like a knife. Hospitals overflowed, appointments were delayed, and fear seeped into every corner of their lives. And yet, the bills didn't stop. Mortgage, utilities, prescriptions, credit card minimums. Each envelope still arrived, demanding payment as though nothing had changed. Emily sat at the table with her parents, calculators between them, trying to stretch every dollar. The stimulus check helped, but only for a moment. Unemployment benefits came tangled in red tape. Relief felt less like salvation, more like a cruel reminder that the system was built for someone else. On television, the divide was stark. Markets climbed again, corporations spoke of resilience, billionaires grew richer. But in the Miller neighborhood, eviction notices spread like shadows. Families packed cars in the middle of the night, slipping away quietly, ashamed of what had happened to them. One evening, Emily returned home to find Linda at the kitchen sink, her shoulders slumped. "We can't keep this up," Linda whispered. Robert sat at the table, silent, staring at the floor. For decades, he had carried the role of protector, but now his silence spoke of surrender. Emily wanted to promise them safety. She wanted to believe she could hold them together. But inside, she felt the same trap closing, tighter than ever, sharper than ever. The pandemic stripped away the illusions. There was no cushion, no safety net, no real protection for ordinary families. The Millers saw it clearly now, all those years of struggle, all those decades of labor, and still they lived paycheck to paycheck, crisis to crisis. By late 2020, the family was still standing. But they were tired. So tired. The laughter that once filled their house had been replaced by sighs, by silence, by the quiet calculation of survival. Emily sat in her childhood bedroom one night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of her grandparents during the Depression, of her parents through the recessions, of herself through the crash and now the pandemic. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Generations had changed. The traps had not. The world slowly reopened. Masks came off, businesses flickered to life, classrooms cautiously welcomed students. The noise of life returned, but for the Millers, nothing felt entirely new. Robert's back pain persisted, each movement a reminder of decades spent on factory floors and construction sites. He took small jobs when he could, careful not to overexert himself, careful not to stumble into an accident that would cost more than they could bear. Linda still tutored, though fewer students returned after the pandemic, fewer parents willing to pay for help they barely understood. Emily, now in her early 40s, juggled her office job and freelance work. Her student loans still loomed, their shadows longer than ever. She moved with precision, each paycheck allocated like a map: rent, utilities, groceries, medical bills, loan payment, a delicate balance that left no room for mistakes. The house, once vibrant with children's laughter, felt quieter. Emily's childhood posters had been packed away, the swing set dismantled, the floors polished to hide the scars of years. The walls carried memories of hope, struggle, birthdays, late-night homework sessions, but also a heaviness that no renovation could erase. Credit card offers still arrived. Banks advertised wealth, luxury, escape, yet the Millers understood their real meaning: opportunity disguised as obligation. They had learned to say no, to calculate every swipe, to resist the siren call of easy money. But resistance was exhausting, a constant vigilance that stole energy and peace of mind. Health concerns never truly faded. Annual checkups, prescriptions, aches, and illnesses reminded them of their mortality. Each cough, each twinge, each reminder of aging carried financial implications as well as personal ones. Even ordinary life required planning, foresight, and calculation. Emily thought often of her grandparents, of Thomas and Helen, and the life lessons carried silently through generations. Sacrifice. Prudence. Endurance. She understood now that survival itself had been a curriculum, shaping each choice, each habit, each instinct. And yet, she felt the unfair weight of it, the reality that ordinary people like her family were constantly navigating traps built for them, not by them. The pandemic had amplified it, but the roots ran deep. Decades of cultural, economic, and institutional systems had created a world where security was never guaranteed, where debt was a companion more loyal than any friend, where work never fully equaled reward. Robert and Linda, sitting quietly in the evenings, often reflected on their life. They had endured wars, recessions, financial crises, pandemics, and yet they persisted. Their hands were worn, their bodies tired, but their dignity remained intact. They had survived not by luck alone, but by a relentless commitment to endure. Emily, observing her parents, realized that the cycle was not just financial, it was emotional. The traps were measured in dollars and cents, but also in worry, in the quiet fear of failure, in the generational inheritance of struggle. She carried it all forward, aware that the choices she made today could ripple for decades, just as her parents' choices had. And so, the Millers remained, ordinary people navigating extraordinary financial traps. Their story was neither rare nor unique. Across America, millions moved through the same patterns: hope and fear intertwined, labor and debt entwined, survival and sacrifice inseparable. They had endured, yes. But endurance was no longer a guarantee of security, it was simply a testament to human resilience in a world that rarely offered fairness. And in the quiet of their home, Emily, Robert, and Linda sat together, side by side, aware of the fragility, aware of the history, aware that the next generation would inherit the same landscape: bright promises, hidden dangers, and the perpetual need to survive. The traps had changed over the decades, grown more complex, more invisible, more suffocating. Yet one thing remained constant: the ordinary humans caught inside them, striving to endure, striving to live, striving to keep hope alive. The Millers' story is not unique. It is a mirror held up to millions of families across America, ordinary people, living ordinary lives, yet navigating extraordinary financial traps. Decades of labor, sacrifice, and cautious planning have carried them through crises both personal and national. And yet, the weight of debt, the pressure of bills, the invisible hand of a system designed to profit from their perseverance has never fully released its grip. As we watch them sit together in the quiet of their home, hands intertwined, eyes reflecting both weariness and quiet pride, we understand the paradox of survival. To endure is a victory, but endurance is not freedom. Every paycheck, every decision, every sacrifice has been a step along a path laid with unseen obstacles, many inherited, many imposed by circumstance. Their story is a testament, not to wealth or security, but to resilience, to the quiet dignity of people who continue despite the odds, who love despite the strain, who hope despite the uncertainty. And it is a cautionary reminder: the American dream, for many, is not a destination, but a journey fraught with hidden costs, invisible snares, and lessons learned too late. The Millers, and families like them, carry on. Balancing hope and reality, past and present, survival and longing. And in that delicate balance lies the truth of a nation, that ordinary lives can be extraordinary, not in riches, but in the courage it takes to keep moving forward, one day at a time.